Blasiak, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to our webinar dedicated to a monumental exhibition currently on view at the Mudam Museum in Luxembourg of William Kentridge. By way of introduction, let me bring you the profile of the artist before I introduce our distinguished speakers. William Kentridge, born in 1955 in Johannesburg, has been making art for more than 4 decades. Anchored in the practice of drawing, his extensive oeuvre encompasses filmed animation, performance, theater, and opera. The exhibition at the Mudam Museum in Luxembourg is the first of its kind in presenting Kentridge's artistic production alongside works for stage and opera. For the Red Bridge project, a collaboration between Mudam Luxembourg, the Philharmonic of Luxembourg, and the City of Luxembourg's Grand Theatre. William Kentridge, known for his animated films that employ charcoal drawings made through a distinctive process of erasure and recovery, he moves across and between mediums and disciplines in a dynamic play of deconstruction and recomposition of visual forms. His work is resolutely narrative in its treatment of themes connected to history, time, and the importance of absurdity in the world of pronounced certainties. Kentridge addresses these subjects through the lens of his native South Africa. I am so honored to have today the prominent speakers of our webinar, Madam Suzanne Cotter, Mudam Museum Director based in Luxembourg, and Mr. Aebhric Coleman, Executive Director at Marian Goodman Gallery, recently Marian Goodman Projects. Maybe 2 words about the Mudam Museum before we go on to the artistic journey of William Kentridge. Mudam was designed by Sino-American and Pritzker Prize winning architect Ming Pei. The architecture of the museum is intended as a dialogue between the natural and the historical context of its site. In the orientation, it represents a link between the past, as it sits on the former Fort Tungen and the historic city of Luxembourg, and the present, which is, and then future, the European district of Kirchberg in Luxembourg, with its neighboring cultural institutions such as the Philharmonic concert designed by Christian de Port-Zamperk and the Place de l'Europe by Ricardo Bofill. Mudam is an iconic architectural landmark of Luxembourg City. By way of introduction, let me present to all of you the biography of our speaker, Madame Suzanne Cotter, the director of the Mudam Museum. Suzanne was the director of the Serralves Museum of Contemporary Art from 2013 until 2018. She has held curatorial positions at the Salman Guggenheim Foundation in New York for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi project, Modern Art Oxford in the UK, the Hayward Gallery, the Whitechapel Art Gallery, and the Serpentine Gallery in London. She's curated over 100 exhibitions of contemporary art and artistic projects and commissions. She has edited and contributed to numerous catalogs and publications on contemporary artists and lectured in museums and institutions around the world. Among awards and honors received are the 2014 Best Projects Award from the Association of Portuguese Museums and the Alice Artistic Landmark in Contemporary Experience Prize in 2011 for the 10th Biennale Sharia, which she co-curated with Rasha Salti and Haig Ivasian. In 2005, she made the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts and des Lettres in France. Suzanne is a board member and secretary and treasurer of CIMAM, the International Committee of Modern and Contemporary Art Museums and Collections, and chair of the committee Outstanding Museums Practices Award. Welcome, Suzanne, to the webinar. Our second prominent speaker is the executive director of Marian Goodman Gallery, Aebhric Coleman. Good afternoon, Aebhric. You are leading the Marian Goodman Projects team in London. Previously, you were the director of the Kramlich Collection in California, one of the world's most important private collections of film, video, and media art. You worked on many large exhibitions with international museums, in addition to book publications, film productions, and construction management of a house museum by the very famous Herzog and de Meuron. Welcome to our webinar. As we move on to the artistic journey of William Kentridge, and as we embark on the panel discussion with our guest speakers, I would like to address a first question to Suzanne. It would be wonderful to speak later on some detail about some of the works included in the exhibition. However, I wanted to start by asking if you could firstly introduce us to the curatorial concept of the exhibition you organized on William Kentridge's work, and secondly, the research process and dialogue you had with the artist in selecting and laying out the presentation of the artworks in view.
Okay. Thanks, Karolina, and thank you for the invitation to take part in today's webinar around our exhibition on William Kentridge, and thank you for your kind words of introduction. And it's great to be here with Aebhric as well. Thanks, Aebhric, for all the work you've put into this afternoon. I think we're going to show some material, and there's a brief, some brief footage, some film to be shown, but just what I can say, should we show that first, or I say something? Or we're just showing you some images here. The concept, the curatorial concept, in fact, let's say what was the trigger, what was the point of departure for this exhibition? It really was something you mentioned earlier, which is a sort of an extraordinary and exceptional collaboration between our museum, the Musée d'Art Moderne Conduction, Mudam is its acronym, the Philharmonie of Luxembourg, and the Grand Théâtre Luxembourg. And we're all joined, we're all linked by this extraordinary bridge that goes from the historic plateau of the Old City to the European plateau of Kirchberg, where we are. You can walk across the bridge. It's called the Red Bridge in common terms. It's the Pont de Grande Duchesse Josephine Charlotte is its full name. But this project of the Red Bridge project is one of building bridges between our institutions, and it had its first edition in 2018-19, focused around the choreographer and Tristan Kirsmacher. And then for the second edition, William Kentridge was the artist who came up as the one who, if he accepted our invitation, would be an absolutely wonderful artist to be able to feature, precisely because of his work as a visual artist, but also extends into the realms of performing arts, performance, theatre, and opera. And so really it was set up from there, but at the time we were doing this, William's work was also the focus of a very large-scale retrospective being presented, that was being organized and subsequently presented in 2019 at the Beyeler Foundation in Basel. And this toured, a version of it toured subsequently to the Lille Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Lille in early 2020. And in fact, I went to the opening of that exhibition 2 weeks before the museum. We all went into lockdown because of COVID. So I think the challenge for us was to, and for myself as a curator of this particular exhibition, to conceive of a show that would add to this recent exhibition, but also to the many, many exhibitions of William's work that have been organized and presented around the world William is a prolific artist, and he's perhaps one of the most well-known and acclaimed contemporary artists living and working today. Because of this unique combination of a museum with an orchestra hall and a theatre that also shows opera, I really looked to focus with William around his new work, and this work really came out of work for an opera. So the exhibition came out of an opera, but William's work is so, how can I say, it multiplies. It may begin, a particular body of work may begin with one project, but then it multiplies and remultiplies into a lot of different forms that then can become other projects themselves. And this is the case, for example, with his films. We have 2 new films in the exhibition, and then the drawings relating to the films, sculptural work that relate to them. And then we're also showing very new work. You're seeing some of this on screen, which is a sound piece composed of these monumental megaphones, and out of which is heard 7 different compositions that were commissioned by William from composers and long-time collaborators of his from South Africa. So this is a durational piece over time. And then we have a sort of pendant or anchoring these new works. There's great work, and some considered to be one of William's most important works, More Sweetly Play the Dance, and from which we gave the title of the exhibition. And this work was shown because it's a chef-d'oeuvre, considered a chef-d'oeuvre, and because it brings together all of the dimensions of William's practice, from drawing to drawings for projection, to film, to dance, to performance, to music, to opera, and all coming together in a tremendous theatrical experience, but a theatrical experience that's created for a museum. I can't remember what the second part of the question was, but that's sort of, really how it came about. So the other, I think, important thing to say is whenever you present an exhibition, you want it to mean something and not just be the duplication of what's been done elsewhere. That being said, William's work, well, William is well known. His work had not been shown in Luxembourg, even though we possess a work by him, Xeno Writing from 2003, and which we will be actually showing in our museum collections this month. We will be installing it. His work overall is not known by a larger and broader public. So it was very important with this exhibition to also be thinking through how to communicate these different dimensions in his work, both formally and thematically.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. That's very insightful. And as we see the images of the beautifully presented exhibition, you are the main curator of the exhibition. I think Aebhric would like to show us a short video.
Well, I think you may have been seeing some of the video playing in the background, and there are some still images here. And Suzanne, thank you so much for that context to how you put together the exhibition. And I was wondering if you could speak maybe a little bit further to that diversity and range of work, both in format, in medium, but also in the scale of experience, because we've seen from the images there the very large installation of More Sweetly Play the Dance, but equally the smaller projection pieces in the way that you've presented them. How were you thinking and working with William about the layout and kind of range of work with that in mind in the museum?
Well, I think once we had, with William, recognized that the Sibyl, the opera, the Sibyl, which is being co-produced by the Rome Opera and the Grand Théâtre of Luxembourg, that there was a film that was associated with it and a whole body of drawings and works. We knew that was one constellation. And then in Basel, William actually showed, it's the 11th, talked about as the 11th film in this series of so-called drawings for projections, which are actually stop-start animations made from William's drawings, and which William subjects his drawings to these processes of accumulation and of erasure. And they become a very distinctive language. It's a narrative language, and they sort of always seem to be based somehow in the landscape of Johannesburg, where William is from and where he still lives and works, and its history within South Africa. So they were already, and with that, there's a whole body of work. So I really was looking at the selection. We knew we had the films, but saying, well, what are the works associated? So it was selecting drawings. And then I also wanted to introduce the dimension of sculpture, which is perhaps less known or appreciated in William's work overall, but which I first saw actually at Marian Goodman Gallery in London. Might have been early 2019, I can't remember now. COVID's shifted my sense of time. But where there were drawings, and there were some drawings for projection related to theatre pieces. And then there was a room that had these, were smaller scale bronzes, but bronzes of the lexicon, his lexicon, which is a lexicon of everyday objects that, you know, a kind of people or occupy his films since the very beginning, these early films we've seen since the late 1980s. And I was fascinated by them. I didn't quite know how to understand them. And then when I went to South Africa, to the Sites Museum, to Cape Town, and I saw his retrospective, his first retrospective in South Africa, huge, in the Sites Museum of Contemporary Art. And then an accompanying exhibition at the Norvell Foundation dedicated solely to his sculptures. I was able to understand them and appreciate them, the sculptural work, let's call it the three-dimensional work, that much more. And I felt in researching for the exhibition, it was important to perhaps weave that aspect or that dimensionality and that dimension of his practice within the exhibition, because of course, as we see here on this image, these sculptures also reprise themes that recur throughout his work, such as the theme of the procession, and of course, more sweetly played, the dance is this extraordinary procession, but this idea of language, the procession as a narrative, and then within narrative, this idea of language, how we make meaning, how we make sense from what we see or from what we read. So this whole question of sense and nonsense, the rational, the absurd, which runs throughout William's work, both figuratively, I would say, but also philosophically. So in discussing with William how we might do it and what the show might be, because our spaces are very particular. I mean, thank you, Karolina, talking about the monumental exhibition. I would say William's work is monumental in its scope and in its impact. And it is true, the architecture of our museum is monumental. It's an architecture, you know, I.M. who designed the Pyramid du Louvre and all of the refurbishment of the Louvre in relation to that. The National Gallery of Washington being his first museum from the 1970s. But the galleries and the way the museum is organized, we have these, it's symmetrical. It's like an arrow or I think of it as a butterfly. These two very, on either side, large scale galleries of between 400 to 450 square meters. So it really, I was interested in how do we exploit the morphology of the space in a way that really enhances the presentation of the work and the experience of the work. And when William came to visit the museum, he loved, he instantly said on one, oh, more sweetly would look amazing here because it's his work. Although I was thinking of another installation work at the time, The Refusal of Time, and then I sort of shifted. But the other, because I had stressed my interest in being able to show a major installation of his. But on the other hand, to be able to show these other new works and to go into the detail of William's work and give a sense of the importance of process. It was William himself, he said, oh, but this could be like a landscape, which I thought was very, very interesting to think of as a landscape. And you may have noticed on some of the images, we see a lot of drawings of trees, these sort of complex assembled drawings of trees, but also in the films, particularly City Deep, is the landscape, the mining, the former mining landscape of Johannesburg. So thinking of this as a, kind of metaphorically as a kind of landscape was interesting. And then, of course, this emphasis on the importance of process, and that process for William is inextricable from the studio, because everything for William begins in the studio. And so here we worked with another longtime collaborator of William's, Sabine Tönnissen, who is a set designer, who William met at La Monnaie in Brussels when they were working on, I think it was Lulu, I may be wrong on the opera, and subsequently Sabine sort of set out on her own, and she's since collaborated with William on numerous productions for opera, but she's also worked with him on some exhibitions, and the one exhibition which really marked me was precisely the retrospective at the sites in Cape Town, which is, it's an extraordinary space for those who've not seen images of it or had the opportunity to visit, but it's made from a former silo on the old port of Cape Town, where they literally cut out the silos to make this huge central atrium. But the galleries are all on these different floors, and they're not so easy to negotiate. And for William's retrospective, which occupied all the floors, I was really struck with this sort of the way the space had been negotiated, and with these very simple solutions. And some of them you might see here, like use of simple carpentry and wood, but they were definitely interventions that somehow guided you through the exhibition, but they carried with them a certain, I don't know if I want to say humility, but kind of modesty, which I think is very in tune with William himself as an artist. There's a very terre-à-terre, grounded way that he thinks about himself and as an artist, and about his work, and the language of his work, objects, the everyday, the landscape, the people around him, the history of South Africa, etc. And so I mentioned that to Williams, how I was struck by the installation design, and he said, oh, we must meet Sabine. So Sabine came with William for the first site visit. And so then, when we were talking, he was talking about the landscape, but obviously talking about process, and I was talking about the way, this multi-dimensionality of his practice. And so Sabine sort of intuitively came up with, it's something she'd tested before, but saying, well, let's think of this space as also the space of the studio. Of course, what you see here, it's much more formal, but it's meant to be an evocation. So where you have drawings laid down on tables, and the simple trestle tables, so that the visitor's experience and encounter with the work could be a little bit like what Williams is when he's actually making them. And then there are some other wonderful kind of, let's call them quotations. You notice these two, you see the two projection boxes, but they're actually the form of those projection boxes, because we're working in daylight here in the space, but the projections to really work, they take the form of old-fashioned film cameras. And I think you see in one of the images of the sculptures, there's an old film camera, which is one of his metamorphosing objects in many of his animated films. So, it's a sort of the creation of a world, but what I'm especially pleased with, the design of Sabine is so precise and beautiful, and we worked on this via Zoom because we're all in lockdown, of course. She lives in Brussels in her studio. I'm familiar with working with maquettes and models, but we sort of tested through the selection and how it might work, and then we sort of came back to William. We didn't really make too many changes, actually. We made a couple of changes, which was more which drawing would go where in the final installation, but it was very much thought through, and with our technical team and registrar team here, who were, played a huge role in the show. So, but in the end, it responds. I think the final exhibition for me responds in a very happy way to the way I think about exhibitions as a kind of choreographed experience. And it shouldn't be a forced choreography, but it's one that enables you to discover your own, to be conscious of your own movements and your own ability to be with work and to think about it at your own pace. So I believe there's a really beautiful temporality to the exhibition that was made possible through our work with Sabine.
Well, Suzanne, thank you so much for such a wonderful and rich overview of the process of working with William in the studio, and all the many considerations in putting together such a large exhibition of his work, because I think you're absolutely right that you know, these different registers are so much part of his practice and so important to convey. And I think I haven't had the pleasure yet of visiting, but look forward to this summer, because I know the show is on until the end of August. You know, I wanted to return to you mentioning about the presentation of what we see on screen here, which are two of Kentridge's most recent film or video works, City Deep and Sybil. And it's wonderful that these are the first museum presentations of these works, which he completed last year, both single channel pieces. But I thought it might be nice to speak about these in a little bit more depth. But before doing so, for the benefit of people who may not have seen the exhibition yet or have seen these works, I thought I might just show a 2-minute clip of City Deep, and we can speak about that and follow that up with Sybil as well. So I will transition here to do that, if you give me one moment. So I might just pause it there. The film is about 10 minutes long, but it hopefully gives a little bit of an impression. I can show some still images in the background, but Suzanne, I thought it would be helpful for people if you could perhaps give a little bit of context to the origins of this work in its specific reference to Johannesburg and South Africa, because it offers many broader reflections on the nature of memory and education and even museums and culture more broadly. But as a starting point, because you had mentioned this before, of this being the 11th in the series of the Soho Eckstein films, but I was wondering if you could perhaps outline to people the background of this alter ego that Eckstein is within Williams' practice of the drawings for projection films. And if you maybe could kind of situate City Deep within the development of those films.
There's so much to say. I don't know if I can, respond in a way that's necessarily worthy and succinctly to the significance of these films and of the figures. But perhaps by saying yes, I think William really came to international attention with these drawings for projection. His second film was Johannesburg, the second greatest city after Paris. I can't remember when the main complaint was, which was the first from '89. But they are a series of remarkable animations, and you can see just from the draftsmanship of William himself that they're absolutely compelling. But the way they, in a way, accompany over time William, a recent history of South Africa, from the period sort of that was announcing pre-apartheid, or at the moment of the ending of apartheid, through to the Truth and Reconciliation period, and then post-apartheid South Africa. And that you have these characters, there's two actually, I think, that are kind of might be alter egos. It's Felix, what's his, I was going to say Teitelbaum, is it? It's Felix and Soho Eckstein. Felix Teitelbaum is like the dreamer, kind of the dreamer that one might more easily associate with the artist, whereas Soho Eckstein is a suited businessman. I think of him, as someone who maybe represented the conflicted, white persona of South Africa. I mean, that's how he came across in the early films of Williams. And I read only very recently, having been reading many of Williams' lectures and interviews, but I read the novel, it was from 1979 by the great South African novelist Nadine Gordimer, the novel The Conservationist. And in it, there's a character who we don't really know much about him. He's sort of sketched out, but he's a businessman. He's sort of an industrialist of some sort in Johannesburg, but he has this property out in the countryside. And he's a totally conflicted person in terms of his relationship. I mean, he's secure and yet he's not. And William talks about this book as being very influential for him, and it was amazing to read this book. But I think that the figure of Eckstein is one that he's evolved historically over time. And, it's often been said that maybe he's an alter ego of William. I mean, he looks a bit like him. But I think William said it's not really him at all. It's a bit like his other figures. It's like the coffee pot or the cruche or various things. They're like figures that he brings in, a bit like he talks about commedia dell'arte. It's like they serve a role. I think he sort of serves a role, he plays a role of a past South Africa, coming to terms with itself. And so you see him looking in the portraits that then become his portrait, that then becomes a portrait of a Black South African. The actual location is also, it's a place of memory. It's the South African Art Gallery, but as it existed when William was a child, because it's being refurbished and changed, but he remembers his visits to this art gallery. So he's also digging into his memories. So I think there's something very psychoanalytical that we in these images, but at the same time they are, and even on this clip that you've stopped at, if you look in the background, we're seeing like a display box, but that could actually be his like kind of sculptures. Yeah. So he's always introducing, there's a kind of endless multiplication that goes on as kind of mise en abîme into into these works that are narrative, that I think are ways of thinking about history. And so here, for example, this is a still of someone working in these shallow mines that they call people who worked, did shallow mining, not the deep mining, which is a subject of earlier films by William, the earlier animations. These are people, they're kind of illegal miners, but effectively scratching a living. And that they, you know, it was about an alternative economy, but in the film we see them also morphing into graves. And we see, again, all of these films, he brings back these recurring themes. It's like a family it's a world, it's a universe that we recognize, but he's always saying different things with them. So the idea of the whole becoming a grave and the body in the landscape becoming a mound and becoming part absorbed into the landscape. It all connects, of course, with his experience of the world. And when you visit William, if one has the extreme privilege of visiting him, of going to South Africa firstly, and then of visiting with William, you can see what he talks about this land. It's kind of an ugly landscape around Johannesburg because it's full of old slag heaps, and you know, it was just totally mined. It was mined for iron, for gold. It's part of a huge rush from the late 19th century. So the landscape is very present, but somehow the landscape comes to represent also South Africa and Africa and its histories. So it's very thoughtful. But the other important thing I think to note here, and I think for people who are joining us today, they will have picked up on the music and the sound. And these films are, animated also by the music that accompanies them. And in this case, for City Deep, it's a combination of compositions. There's music by John Cage, music for prepared piano, and other composed music. I'm afraid I don't have the credits with me, but by a South African composer. But they, within the framework of the exhibition, music and sound is incredibly important. And so that's something else about the exhibition at Mudam, is we've really thought about it as a kind of composition. I talked about a choreography, but it's also sonically, it's also a composition in time, because then you end in the Great Hall with the large Almost Don't Tremble. He wanted See the Mouth is Dreaming. This was originally, I think, the title of the work he was going to give it, but The Mouth is Dreaming actually comes from a text written by one of his the many people who have written about the work. And so he felt he couldn't do that, so he changed the title of the work. But in fact, this film now is going to, has been developed and form like the second act to the opera of Waiting for the Sibyl. And it is called The Mouth is Dreaming, actually. So it's it procreates. His work, he makes one thing and then it's reproducing itself, but in another form, this sort of constant metamorphosis. And I think we're seeing here, for example, in the stills, we saw a little bit earlier with the back of the painting, but these moments of erasure. And this is also, let's say, it's not only a metaphor, it literally is process that's is used as a narrative tool within the work, because once he's erased those drawings or blacked them over, they're done. And we actually show one of those drawings in the museum. So everything it's in a state of dynamic flux, which is, I think it's a very important thing to appreciate in his work, but I think also has quite profound significance in thinking about ourselves as people in time, in society, in the world.
I think you're absolutely right, Suzanne, and you've described it very eloquently, because that process that kind of comes from animation of adding and subtracting in some ways, and the buildup of imagery is used by William in such a way that it is a reflection on the passage of time in a kind of more historical and social way, and a little like you're describing with Johannesburg and and the city being known for its deep mining, but also the surface mining that you're describing. And the city deep in some ways has been a reflection of the changes that William himself has kind of documented in his own work of that particular city and of South Africa. And so you have that kind of social, cultural transformation that's evidenced in even a single drawing like one of these, because these are obviously taken from the process of making the video itself. So you have, if you like, the evidence, the document of that, with everything kind of combined into it. And often, you know, these red markings, a little bit like a cinematographer would set up and compose things. So you have all the, of course, the historical references to craft and draftsmanship, but equally that kind of cinematographic framing devices that are used. And I thought actually that would be a good point when you were mentioning the importance of music and dance and performance in William's work, to maybe just show a brief clip of Sybil, which is the other recent film he completed last year that you're presenting at Mudam. And so I'll just do that, and then maybe we can speak for a couple of minutes on that. I'm mindful of our time, but I will just move over to that. It's never easy to pause when one's enjoying to watch so much, but it gives a little bit of a sense of the work. And just watching it there, I'm very conscious of, Suzanne, as you were describing, the many layers that are within even just one piece of Williams, because we have graphically, you know, these references to, you know, 20th century art history, even, you know, with constructivism, Russian constructivism, which has been something that he's dwelt on in many ways, graphically, but also through Russian poetry. But the influence of Dadaism in his use of language is something that in his collage work is deeply important. And also for us as viewers, as appreciators of his work, he has a certain expectation that we, rightly so, have to be part of the piece in trying to interpret it and understand it. And he very much brings us into that, whether it's in big spatial installations like More Sweetly Play the Dance, as you said, that kind of panorama of landscape, but equally in a piece like this, which can be presented even on a large television screen or projected in the way that you have at the museum. There is work for us to do in deciphering and enjoying the kind of pleasure of the many layers that William puts into these pieces. And I thought it might be useful to just describe briefly something that William has written on this work, where he said, Sybil centers around our relationship of hope, foreboding, expectation, and anxiety towards the future and our faith. The turning pages allude to the myth of the Cumean Sybil, who would write your fate on an oak leaf and place the leaf at the mouth of her cave, accumulating a pile of oak leaves. But as you went to retrieve your particular oak leaf, a wind would turn and swirl the leaves, so that you never knew if you were getting your fate or someone else's fate. One wishes to avoid one's fate, but one knows that one is headed directly towards it. You know that it is coming, but you cannot predict it. Hovering over the piece is the awareness that our contemporary Sybil is the algorithm, which knows us and our destinies better than we do. And I think that's a really interesting reference point to where he's taking these historical moments of literature and culture and combining it with something which is a very contemporary reflection on where we are now and where we're going, and these aspects of artificial intelligence and everything, which are becoming a very, whether we know it or appreciate it or understand it, a very important part to how we gather information about the world and how we perceive the world. I was wondering, Suzanne, if you wanted to kind of speak a little bit more to that kind of narrative aspect that is within this particular work, and this dynamic of using also old history books, but in this case dictionaries, which is something that's very present, where he's drawn on historical colonial ledgers or tomes of knowledge.
Sure. I mean, you've already said a lot, I think, which is really helpful. And also I'm conscious of time, because I think we only have about just over 10 minutes. So, you know, what you said is great. Great. There are a couple of interesting things maybe I just pick up on. One is that this, when you watch it, and it is a shame, I mean, you need to come to see the exhibition and really appreciate the work, but when you hear the music, the way it builds up, overlays on itself and builds up, it's absolutely extraordinary. But all of this really is a work that it didn't begin with this work. This is a work that is the result of the work that the opera Waiting for the Sybil. And so these images and these projected films and projected bodies form part of the staged performance that you see, but you have real dancers and singers on stage, and there's a lot of other things going on. I say something about the color, which is, I think, great when it pops in, because, you know, William is not known as a colorist. Most of his work, we see it's in shades of black and white and gray. We'll see these red markings, as you were saying, of almost like cinematic markings or time markings for his drawings that he used in the films for projection. But here we're seeing these abstractions and these little moments of projection, which, yes, allude to the language of Russian constructivism among other, and modernism in general. But the context for the Sybil, I think, is significant here, in that William was invited by the Rome Opera to create a new work for stage that would speak to a work that was commissioned by Alexander Calder, and that was first in the 1960s, and that was presented at the Rome Opera in 1968, and it's called Work in Progress, and that work is 19 minutes long, and it's pure abstraction. It's a performance of abstraction with Calder's mobiles, moving forms, and indeed people on bicycles in sort of these colored forms. And Waiting for the Sybil, and obviously the reference to the Cumean Sybil, etc., the context of Rome, I think somehow situates there. And this was presented as the sort of main event after the present in 2019 or 1819 in Rome, but after the presentation of this extraordinary work by Calder. So the color, of course, when you see it, it's in there, and it's in the costumes and these sort of discs-like costumes of the performers in the opera. William has set up, you know, there are kind of chapeau salute to Calder, so they come in, they enter in there. But speaking with Sabine Tönnissen, she also talked about the fact that William works a lot with a very well-known costume designer, also from Belgium, Sabine, and they often have asked William about color, and actually it's through his work for opera that he started sort of playing more with color, because with works for stage, you're dealing with costume. So there's something that sort of comes in there, but also links again to the language of modernist abstraction. I think another point that I would make, and I think is very interesting about the Sibyl, is the theme, which is a theme that stems or springs from antiquity, and William has looked at that a lot. I don't think we're going to have time to talk about Plato's cave and the shadows and the procession. That's for another one. But he's looked at it a lot. But I think that these questions of fate and what the future is, or the ungraspable nature of our future, whether we can really think about what we can learn from the past, if we can, etc., is all incredibly relevant. And one might think of it in relation to present day South Africa, but one also thinks about it in terms of the world. And I think this is a very crucial thing about William's work, which is, while it's firmly anchored in his own context as a South African artist, South African history, he sees his work speaking to broader themes in the world. And this is what is also something that is truly great about his work, because it does. I mean, the final point that I just pick up on is your one about the analog, the algorithm, which is amazing because William is such an analog artist. I mean, he draws on paper and he makes things with his hands, and even his films is actually film. It's not, and he does a drawing and he steps back and he does more film. Okay, he works with digital technology, but he's an analog artist. It's all about the making. So it's funny to read that in his quote, but at the same time, I think I agree with you that thinking about the idea of the Sibyl in relation to sort of digital culture and technology and artificial intelligence is actually incredibly interesting and incredibly resonant, because in the end, perhaps it's the same questions that are arising, but they're coming at us at a different technological moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're quite right to kind of underscore the analog and the importance of that in his work, because in many ways, I think even his direct reference to that, but in a very subtle and kind of short, succinct way, prompts us to kind of even think about, and this is the joy of artists' work, that we can think about subjects like that through the benefit of a kind of longer passage of time, and particularly in William's work, broader ethical issues and moral issues and societal issues that go with that. And I think, certainly, even just doing that in the last 20, 30 years of South African history and what that means to us all as we think about the future of electric vehicles and everything else. The continent of Africa is still very much part of our future as we think of all of those aspects from every aspect. So Karolina, I know we need to kind of wrap up. I'll just in the background show some images of some sculptural works by Kentridge that Suzanne was kindly referring to, and we saw examples of in the exhibition there in Luxembourg.
I wanted to thank both of you for a very generous expose of such a wonderful exhibition encompassing various mediums and genres, and it gives us really the craving right now to jump on a plane and come to Luxembourg and see the exhibition in person. However, I think this presentation, which you kindly prepared, Aebhric, gave us already a nice insight and appetite to explore more the work and the oeuvre of William Kentridge. I wanted to thank you very much for your passion and for this generous presentation. And I wanted to conclude while we are looking at the beautiful sculptures of William Kentridge at Marian Goodman Gallery. I wanted to conclude with a quote by the founder of the gallery, Marian Goodman herself. She said, "Art enriches life. It is a dialogue. The artists I represent come from different backgrounds and generations, but I feel they are artists who have the ability to root their work in reality in one form or another." And I think that quote really resumes perfectly the character and the essence of the exhibition also at Mudam, because for having seen the exhibition myself in person recently in Luxembourg, I was truly transformed, and that transformative aspect of that exhibition was clearly visible and will remain with all of us.
Well, I think that all comes down to William and his work. I mean, he's the one that sort of nourishes us all. So thanks very much. It's been great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for your fantastic questions and presentation and discussion. It's been really nice. Thank you, Karolina.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Aebhric, and we look forward to coming to Luxembourg and to London.
Yes, come to Luxembourg. The museum is open, and we have a number of other beautiful exhibitions alongside, and it would be fabulous to see more visitors. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.